Have you ever looked at the political world and just wondered, why is everything so divided, so black and white? It really feels like there's no room for nuance anymore, like the middle ground has just completely disappeared. Well, today we're going to dive into Neil Gonsalves' analysis of exactly how that happened and what it really means for all of us.
Right out of the gate, Gonsalves hits us with this really provocative statement. It's an obvious nod to Nietzsche, and it's a bold claim that sets the stage for this whole investigation. So, if the political center is dead, who killed it? And maybe more importantly, how did we let it happen?
To get to the bottom of it, the analysis says we have to look way deeper than just a simple left versus right shouting match. It actually frames our polarization as the result of a super complex biopsychosocial ecosystem. That's a mouthful, I know, but it's basically a mix of our biology, our psychology, and our social environment. So let's start the diagnosis.
Okay, so our diagnosis begins with the first patient, if you will, the global rise of right-wing populism. And it's important to see that this isn't something that's just unique to one country. No, this is a huge, widespread trend that's been building for a couple of decades now. We're talking about a massive global shift over the last 20 years. I mean, you look at countries from Poland and Hungary to Italy and France, populist movements have successfully tapped into some very real, very deep economic anxieties. Fears about globalization, trade, and, yeah, the rise of AI. The analysis really points a finger at hyperglobalization as a key factor. Now, on one hand, it created just enormous wealth and lifted tons of people out of poverty in developing nations. But it had a totally different effect in the developed world. Here, the middle and working classes started to feel left behind as jobs moved overseas and their paychecks just stopped growing. And that, right there, created the perfect fertile ground for a brand new kind of politics. And what happened was, this created a kind of political vacuum. As left-leaning parties started to focus more on the highly educated professionals who were doing great in the new knowledge economy, while right-wing parties saw a huge opportunity. They jumped in and built this powerful new coalition of voters who felt like they'd been abandoned both economically and culturally. All right, so now let's look at the second patient in this diagnosis, because while all that was happening on the right, the analysis argues there was a parallel shift going on over on the left, one that moved it further and further away from its traditional blue-collar base. So as the left's base of voters changed, it makes sense that its priorities changed too. The focus really shifted towards social justice activism and identity politics. Now, while these conversations were tackling absolutely vital issues, the analysis suggests this new emphasis started to alienate some of those working-class voters, who felt like their worries about their jobs and their wallets were no longer the top priority. To really dig into this, the analysis brings up this fascinating concept from sociologist Musa Al-Gharbi, symbolic capitalists. Okay, think of it this way. The theory suggests these are professionals, in fields like media or academia or HR, who can use the language of social justice to gain social influence for themselves without actually creating real, tangible change for the people they claim to be helping. And look, this isn't just some abstract theory. There's actually data that seems to back it up. A YouGov survey found this pretty significant perception gap among working-class voters. It suggests that the left's cultural shift had a very real political impact, and it made a lot of people feel like the party had just drifted too far away from their concerns. So you've got these two major forces pulling further and further away from the center. And next, the analysis pinpoints a critical moment where these extremes basically collided and just strangled the middle. It uses the Tea Party and the Occupy Wall Street movements as a kind of case study. What's so interesting is how the analysis presents these movements as these unlikely twins. I mean, on the surface, they were polar opposites, right? But if you look closer, they were weirdly similar. Both claimed to be decentralized, grassroots movements. Both used this fiery, anti-establishment rhetoric. And, critically, both saw their once fringe ideas get sucked right up into the mainstream of their respective parties. But what about that whole grassroots claim? Well, the data here tells a different story. Participants in both movements were way more educated than the general population, especially Occupy, where a stunning 76% of protesters had a college degree. This really challenges that popular narrative, and it makes you ask, who were these movements really representing? So the key takeaway here is that these movements, which were amplified like crazy by the media, had this just outsized influence. They basically injected fringe ideologies straight into the political bloodstream, which made the extremes seem way more representative than they actually were. And this created this powerful illusion that the quiet, centrist majority had just disappeared. So, why are we so vulnerable to this kind of division in the first place? Well, the analysis now zooms out from politics to look at the underlying condition, those biopsychosocial factors that are kind of hardwired into all of us and make polarization so easy.
Let's start with biology. Gonsalves reminds us that, hey, our brains evolved for tribal living. We are fundamentally wired for in-group solidarity, sticking with our crew, and out-group suspicion. It's an ancient survival instinct that, in the modern political world, makes us super susceptible to these us versus them stories. Then you've got our own psychology. We all have these mental shortcuts or biases that can really get in the way. There's negativity bias, which makes us pay way more attention to threats and bad news. And then there's confirmation bias, which makes us actively hunt for information that proves we're already right. You put those two together, it's the perfect recipe for creating those digital echo chambers we all hear about. And finally, our social environment. Gonsalves argues that in our online tribes, nuance is seen as a weakness. Ideological purity is what gets rewarded, and this dynamic just completely erodes our ability to find common ground, to compromise, or even just to cooperate with people who happen to see the world a little differently. The result of all this is a massively distorted conversation. I mean, just look at this statistic from the source. Only 10% of online users create 80% of all political content. Think about that. A tiny, vocal, and often extreme minority is setting the entire tone, totally skewing our perception of reality and making us feel way more divided than we probably are. So that's the diagnosis. And yeah, it's a pretty grim one. But the analysis doesn't just leave us hanging there without any hope. It turns to the prognosis, and it asks, can moderation be revived? And the answer is yes. But the cure, it argues, is actually in our hands, the hands of the electorate. The prescription that's offered has three basic parts. First, we have to demand substance, not just political theater and entertainment. Second, we have to hold our representatives accountable for actually debating policy, not just launching attacks on their opponents. And finally, we have to make politicians truly earn our vote, instead of just settling for that lazy argument that the other side is worse. And the analysis leaves us with this final, really powerful question. Again, echoing Nietzsche. It turns the mirror right back on us. If the censor has been killed, well, maybe the only way to bring it back to life is for each of us to embody the principles of moderation, of good faith debate, and of common sense in our own lives. Look, we've really only scratched the surface of this deep and thought-provoking analysis. If you want to explore the full argument and that powerful call for clarity in these divided times, you can find the entire text in Neil Gonsalves' book, I'm Not Your Token.